her dignity behind on the church floor. It started with the candle. She was made to hold it in both hands, arms outstretched. Even if it burned, it looked like penance, but it felt like punishment. The wax dripped fast in the summer heat, landing on her knuckles and wrists. Her hands shook, but she held on. Around her, the crowd watched without saying much. There was always a crowd. Her dress had been dyed a faded yellow, the colour chosen for shame. The hem was dirty, not from sin, but from the road she was forced to walk. Someone had given her sandals, but they were too thin for the stones. She limped by the third corner. The procession was slow, winding through the village like a warning bell made flesh. People lined the sides of the narrow path. Some looked away, others leaned forward with curiosity. A few laughed under their breath. Children pointed, but the adults rarely stopped them. The older women clutched their rosaries with such force that the beads left marks in their palms, but no one stepped forward. This was how it went. A woman caught with desire, or even just accused of it, would be paraded. The priest would claim it was for her salvation. The neighbours would pretend it was tradition, and she would walk, candle in hand, until someone said it was enough. In a nearby village, another woman sat on a low wooden platform. Her crime was similar. She'd been seen speaking to a man after dusk. That alone wasn't proof, but it didn't need to be. She now wore a hood with donkey ears sewn into the sides, meant to make her look foolish. The weight of shame didn't lie in the hood itself, but in the eyes that looked at her. A boy tossed a pebble toward her feet. It rolled, then stopped. She didn't move. Her ankles were bound with a leather strap, just loose enough to let her shift when the cramps set in. Behind her, a priest sat beneath a canopy, fanning himself with a scrap of parchment. He looked bored. Public punishment had a rhythm to it. There was the march, the platform, the sermon, and finally the dispersal. For men, it often ended there. For women, it continued long after. She would return home, but home would feel different. Every eye would weigh more. Every silence would last longer. Doors wouldn't open as easily. Food wouldn't be shared as freely. People remembered things when it involved a woman, especially the things she was accused of. Inside the parish records, you would rarely find their names. They were written down as the woman from the Eastfield or the widow's daughter. Their stories faded faster than the stains on the church floor, but their reputations didn't. Some priests had their secrets, but those stayed in locked rooms. If discovered, they confessed to their superiors, received penance in private, and returned to the pulpit with their robes freshly laundered. No candle procession, no donkey hood, just silence. There was a kind of safety in being male, especially if you wore the right vestments. But for women, the line between sinner and scapegoat was thin, and often it depended on who was watching. Sometimes the punishment was less theatrical. A woman might be forced to kneel on stones during Mass. Another might be ordered to clean the chapel steps with bare hands. The physical pain was nothing compared to the smirks that followed. Public morality had a way of feeding on discomfort, and it seemed to prefer female suffering. At some point, someone made a joke that half the village's sins could be washed clean if they simply made enough women kneel in the square. It wasn't far from the truth. In a convent not far away, a sister was accused of unbecoming dreams. No details were shared, but she was removed from her post in the infirmary. She now scrubbed pots, her hands raw and red from lye. No one asked if the dreams were real. It didn't matter. Justice, for women, was less about truth and more about tone. Did she look guilty? Did she walk with shame? Did she cry in the right places? Sometimes, the only escape was distance. A few women disappeared after the punishments, sent to relatives, moved to other towns. Their stories thinned out like smoke through old chimneys. No one asked too many questions. It was easier that way. When the bells rang again for another confession, another sermon, Another ritual of cleansing. The villagers showed up like always, faces calm, hands folded, and if another woman was called forward, most just watched. What followed next took those punishments and gave them sharper teeth. It wasn't just humiliation anymore. It became something darker, something with horns and accusations that came at night. They did not always scream. Some women whispered instead, caught between sleep and fever, trying to describe things they did not understand. A shape in the corner of the room, a weight on the chest at night, hands that touched without being seen. They did not say the word demon at first. That came later, when someone else put it in their mouth. The interrogation rooms were dark, not by accident, but by design. A single window, too high to see through, walls that smelled of wet stone and old salt. The table in the middle held a small iron crucifix and a cloth for wiping sweat. The questions never changed much. They only got slower, louder, closer. Some women confessed to everything, whether it was true or not. They said they flew through the night on the backs of wolves. They said they kissed the devil's feet and signed his book. One even said she bore his child. The priest wrote it all down, careful not to smudge the ink. It didn't matter if the stories made sense. The more bizarre, the better. It gave shape to the fear. It gave people something to whisper about in markets and beside wells. Of course, the truth was softer, less dramatic. Some women had vivid dreams after long fasts. Others had night terrors, waking up breathless and unsure where they were. Some simply didn't know how to explain the way their bodies reacted when no one was looking. The church called it temptation. Then it was called possession. A woman who showed too much joy or too much independence or too much confusion could easily be labelled. Her moods were studied. Her words are remembered. If she smiled at the wrong person or knew too much about herbs, suspicion followed. A rumour was enough to start the process. A cold stare during Mass. A chicken that died suddenly. A priest who hadn't forgotten a private insult. Once accused, escape was difficult. They were watched during prayer, questioned about dreams, and asked if they had touched animals in strange ways. The absurdity did not bother the interrogators. They had a script. All they needed was a name and a few nights of silence. Some women tried to reason. They quoted scripture. They begged. But reason was not part of the process. A woman who defended herself too well was considered cunning. One who wept too early was faking. One who didn't weep at all was heartless. The ideal suspect, it seemed, was one who neither resisted nor explained. It was safer, sometimes, to say yes, to agree, to admit you had danced with the devil, even if only in your dreams. The confession brought some mercy, or at least an end to the questions. The punishment might be lighter, a pilgrimage, a branding, a banishment. And what exactly did the devil look like? That was always the favourite question. The answers varied. Sometimes a black goat, sometimes a handsome man with a crooked smile. Occasionally, it was the face of someone they knew. This caused problems, especially if the face belonged to someone higher up in the church. Those details rarely made it into the official record. Not every case ended in fire. Some just faded. A few women returned to their homes, older, thinner, quieter. Their gardens are overgrown. Their doors shut more tightly. Their neighbours avoided them in public but watched them through cracks in the shutters. A priest once said that demons preferred the company of women because women were more open to touch. He didn't explain what he meant, but the men listening nodded anyway. It's always easier to agree when you're not the one being accused. The worst part was not the torture itself, but how easily people accepted the idea that a woman's desire, if unspoken or misunderstood, could be explained only by darkness, that her private fears became public sins, that her dreams, once described, became binding contracts with evil. The church found comfort in this logic. It gave them control. It made women afraid to speak, afraid to sleep, afraid to feel. Silence became survival. Obedience became armor. A quiet woman was a safe woman. A curious one was dangerous. There was one case of a woman who confessed to nothing, not even under pain. She said nothing, even when her body began to fail. The town called her a witch anyway. The church wrote her down as uncooperative. She was buried quietly, without a name. Years later, her story was still told, not as a warning, but as a curiosity, like a tale about the weather or strange stars. Looking back, it becomes clear that it was never about demons at all. It was about control, about who could speak and who had to stay silent. And the next time silence didn't work, they looked for markings, for scars, for old dreams, and then they gave those dreams a name. Some ideas were not whispered in church or courtroom. They were worn, welded, and locked in place. Some men believed their honour could be measured by how little access others has to their wives, and so they turned to metal. They crafted it in smithies, shaped it with tools usually used for horse tack or window latches. It was not designed for comfort, it was designed for control. The chastity belt became a symbol, not of faith, but of suspicion. It was made of iron, shaped like undergarments, with a thin slit at the back and a thicker clasp at the front. Some had small padlocks. Some had keys that were worn on chains around the husband's neck. The belts pinched. They left marks, but the men believed that was a small price to pay for peace of mind. They did not ask how it felt. They only asked if it worked. Of course, most women never wore one. Not because their husbands trusted them, but because the device itself was impractical. It rusted. It chafed. It turned daily life into misery. But the idea of it stayed alive, in stories, in threats, in church warnings. How fathers looked at their daughters when they reached a certain age. Control did not always come in metal. It came in layers of cloth, in the rules about how long a hem must be, how tight a bodice, what colour a woman could wear and when. Red was suspicious, black was mournful, green was youthful, blue was for the Virgin Mary, but too much blue, in the wrong cut, made people talk. Women learned to read the room before they opened their trunks. If the day called for modesty, they wore grey. If the mood shifted towards suspicion, they added a veil. Sometimes too much effort was seen as vanity. Too little was called laziness. A man might show pride in his boots. A woman might be punished for the lace on her sleeve. Words were no safer. A woman who spoke with confidence was called proud. One who spoke rarely was called secretive. If she laughed too loudly, people glanced. If she smiled at the wrong time, people whispered. Her body became something watched from all angles, not as a person, but as a problem. The sermons helped keep the pressure steady. Priests warned against temptation, not just the kind that happened between sheets, but the kind that came from glances, gestures, fabrics. Some said the fall of mankind began with a woman and a piece of fruit. That story was repeated often, not for its theology, but for its usefulness. In some villages, a woman could be fined for dressing too boldly. What that meant depended on who was looking. A low neckline, a flash of ankle, even a braid too tightly woven could spark judgment. Once, a woman was accused of witchcraft because she had a red ribbon in her shoe. The ribbon had belonged to her sister. The sister had died in childbirth. That didn't matter to the judge. There was a woman known only by her nickname, the seamstress's daughter. She worked quietly, never married, never caused trouble. But she owned a mirror, a polished, expensive one, and that was enough. People wondered who she looked at in it, or who she hoped would look back. It didn't help that her clothes fit well, that her sleeves were tailored, that her collar had no stains. All this, in a world where virtue was measured in how much dust you allowed to settle on your shoulders. So one day, when a neighbour's husband went missing for a few days, they blamed her. Nothing was proven. Nothing had to be. She was told to leave the village. No trial, just silence. The fear ran deep, not of sin, but of exposure, of being seen as a woman who might enjoy her own reflection, a woman who knew the shape of her hips. That kind of knowledge was dangerous. It could not be allowed to grow. So it was crushed early, with rules, with cloth, with looks, with cold warnings spoken softly. Iron belts were rare, but the daily rituals of control were not. They just came in quieter forms, a mother adjusting a neckline, a priest clearing his throat mid-sermon, a father scowled when his daughter danced too freely at a festival. The chastity belt, in that sense, was just the metal version of things already done by stares and silence. It's strange how many rules existed to protect men from their imagination. Instead of learning restraint, they built it onto someone else's body. Soon, though, the control would shift from what women wore to what they believed, and that brought its own kind of danger. It was not enough to say vows, not enough to sign a parchment or bow before a priest. In many corners of medieval Europe, a marriage wasn't truly a marriage until the act had been done. Not the walking down the aisle, not the ring or prayer, the other act, the one behind the curtains. Except there were often no curtains at all. Once the ceremony ended, the crowd didn't leave. They followed, not to the bedroom, but close enough. The newlyweds were escorted like royalty, not to a throne, but to the bed. It was not a private moment. It was part of the ritual, a procession of family, friends, and in some cases, even officials. Everyone had a role. Some carried linens, others held candles, a few carried drinks to toast the union. It was meant to be festive, but for the couple, especially the bride, it often felt more like a performance than a celebration. The room would be prepared in advance. Clean sheets, fresh herbs were scattered on the floor. Sometimes rosemary or lavender if it could be afforded. On the walls, tapestries were hung not for beauty but to muffle sound. A priest might offer a final prayer, a relative might place a symbolic coin under the pillow. It all seemed quaint from a distance. But then came the expectation. In some regions, witnesses were required to stay close enough to hear. In others, they had to see, not everything, just enough. Enough to confirm that the marriage had been consummated, that the couple had fulfilled their duty. There were even towns where a trusted matron inspected the bedsheet the next morning. If it showed blood, it was proof. If it didn't, questions were asked. Some people whispered. Some took notes. For noble families, this wasn't just tradition. It was politics. A marriage might unite lands or kingdoms, which meant that proving the marriage was real became just as important as the wedding itself. An unconsummated union could be annulled. A child born from it could be questioned. So they left a little room for doubt. In some royal households, a lord or bishop would stand just outside the bedchamber door. He would listen for sounds. Sometimes servants would offer wine to loosen nerves. Sometimes they would sing to cover discomfort. But the expectation remained. The act must happen. Tonight. Publicly private. Privately public. There were stories of brides who cried through it all, of grooms who drank too much and passed out, of sheets hurriedly stained with drops of animal blood to avoid scandal. These stories didn't always make it into official records, but they lived in kitchens, market stalls, and behind chapel doors. One servant girl, whose job was to prepare the bridal chamber, once said the most exhausting part was pretending not to hear what everyone else did. She had folded sheets with trembling hands, knowing they would be inspected. Her mistress had said nothing, but her eyes were full of dread. The groom was twice her age and a stranger until that morning. Among peasants, the pressure was just as real, though perhaps less ceremonial. A neighbour might peek through shutters, a cousin might linger nearby, and if months passed with no child, the gossip would begin. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe she wouldn't. Maybe the marriage wasn't real. In a world without privacy, Bodies were everyone's business. The custom of bedding witnesses varied, but the mindset behind it did not. Intimacy was never just between two people. It belonged to the community, to the family, to the church. A woman's purity was discussed like crop yields or rainfall. A man's performance was judged like harvest labour. No one admitted it out loud, but the truth was that many villagers paid more attention to the bedding than to the actual wedding sermon. And so the first night became a kind of theatre, with props, with pressure, with no intermission, a play no one asked to star in, but everyone came to watch. There's something oddly medieval about imagining love as a contract sealed in front of strangers, but perhaps it was never about love in the first place, just lineage, legacy, land. Later, it wouldn't be the only ritual where women's bodies proved someone else's honour. Some of them would be forced to prove even stranger things. If you think marriage in medieval times meant privacy, affection, or even a sense of personal freedom, you might want to pause that thought. In some places, marriage was not only a public affair but a heavily monitored one. Love was fine in theory, but pleasure, that was something else entirely. Some sermons warned couples about loving each other too much. Too much affection was seen as weakness. Too much joy could damage the soul. One priest even wrote that a husband who laughed with his wife in bed had already begun to rot from within. You might think that was extreme, but for many churchmen, the body was a vessel to be punished, not enjoyed. The idea of mutual satisfaction in marriage made them uneasy. Clerics encouraged restraint in every form. Some advised married couples to abstain from intimacy during religious seasons, which added up to nearly half the year. Others warned that sex, even within marriage, was acceptable only for procreation. And even then, it should be done quickly, quietly, and without emotion. There were also warnings about too much eye contact, too much touching, too much smiling. Yes, smiling could be a sign that your desires had become too strong. Even during the wedding night, some priests recommended that the couple say a prayer beforehand, asking for forgiveness in case passion overtook reason. This mindset didn't stay in the sermons. It entered the bedroom. Some new brides were given strict instructions before their wedding night. Keep your eyes shut. Do not speak. Lie still. You must bear children, not to feel joy. If you made a sound, or worse, if you laughed, you could be whispered about. Some women were later accused of being too eager, too lustful, based solely on what a midwife overheard through a door. In more rigid communities, there were lectures specifically for new wives. These were not gentle or encouraging talks. They were warnings. If you enjoyed yourself, the devil might find his way in. That was not a metaphor. That was a serious belief. A woman's pleasure was seen as an open gate. And so, for many, the wedding night became not a memory of closeness, but a test of silence. This anxiety extended to the setting. Beds were covered in heavy curtains, not only to keep out the cold, but to hide expressions. A flushed cheek, a gasp, or even relaxed breathing could be noted. Privacy was limited. Some couples, especially nobles, were expected to consummate their marriage with witnesses nearby. The witnesses didn't stay for the act, but they did escort the couple to the bed, pulled the covers over them, and often stayed long enough to ensure no one tried to escape. Some church records included letters from worried husbands asking if it was a sin that their wife enjoyed their time together. The reply was usually something like, "It is better not to ask, better to pray, better to keep to yourself." One priest even advised that it was safest if the wife felt nothing at all. The less the body reacted, the less the soul was at risk. To reinforce discipline, some monks practiced their forms of restraint. Wooden planks instead of mattresses, cold water poured over their heads, some tied cords around their thighs to discourage nighttime temptation. They believed that if they could deny themselves, married people should too. After all, what excuse did they have? And so, marriage became another space of monitoring. The clothes, the movements, the silences. Some women were instructed to wear dark fabrics after marriage, as bright colours were associated with pride or seduction. Others were told to cover their hair fully, even at home, and if they were caught humming, laughing, or looking too light-hearted, the scolding could come swiftly. There were always exceptions, of course. Some couples found their ways to exist within the rules, a wink at the wrong time, a hand squeeze under the table, but those were small rebellions, private gestures in a world where even the shape of a sigh could be judged. Over time, many people learned to separate feeling from duty. They did what was expected, and a little more. The irony is, the church preached love constantly. Love of God, love of family, love of virtue, but love between spouses that had limits. Too much, and you were warned. Too little, and you were pitied. Either way, someone was always watching, even if it was just your conscience. As the candles burned low in those cold stone rooms, many newlyweds didn't feel joy. They felt pressure to perform, to behave, to pretend that everything natural had to be filtered through prayer and silence. And over time, they forgot what it felt like to simply hold someone and laugh without fear. In the end, marriage was not just about two people. It was about control, a controlled bed, a controlled home, a controlled heart. And for those who asked too many questions, there was only one answer. Lie still, say nothing, and pray. Soon, we'll step into another space where privacy is even more fragile, where pleasure had to hide beneath penance, and where a single misstep could mean public shame. Stone corridors were not always empty. Behind the quiet discipline of cloister life, some people carried a different kind of secret. Not heresy, not theft, just affection. Love that wasn't expected. Love that had no safe place to speak. It might start in the refectory, with glances exchanged over bread and broth, or in the stillness of the garden, where someone lingered a moment longer by the herbs. Not out of devotion, but because a familiar figure stood nearby. These small moments built something private and persistent. Among monks and nuns, same-sex love was not a legend. It was a reality hidden behind layers of rules and fear. Letters were written in small, careful script, folded, and passed quietly between hands. Words like beloved, dearest, or my light appeared in corners of prayer books or between the pages of copied psalms. These were not just literary flourishes. They were evidence of longing, written by people with no other way to say what they felt. Not loud, not public, but very real. Some walked together through the cloister gardens after morning prayers, pretending their steps were just routine. Others sat side by side in silence, close enough to feel the warmth of another body through heavy wool robes. There were no vows exchanged, no open declarations, but the looks, the gestures, the shared silences all said enough. Sometimes, love meant just being seen. Historical documents rarely describe these relationships directly. The church did not allow space for this kind of love to exist openly, but between the lines, in the smudged ink and trembling handwriting, the truth remains. A few scraps of parchment tell more than sermons. A journal with missing pages, a verse of poetry tucked into a devotional. Phrases like, I think of you when the bell rings or your voice comforts me in the cold. These were the safe ways to say what could not be said aloud. Not all were lucky. When relationships were discovered, punishment could be severe. Some were expelled from their orders, others faced public shame, or worse, accusations of unnatural sin. Women especially suffered more harshly, labelled as temptresses or witches. Men were warned that their souls were at risk, that friendship had become corrupted. But still, the love did not disappear. It just grew quieter. It's easy now to overlook how common this was, not because there are thousands of records, but because the few that survived speak in the same quiet voice. The voice of someone afraid, but still writing, still holding on to affection through ink and memory. For every line that remains, there were many more that were erased, burned or buried in time, yet they existed. These people existed. Their emotions were not mistakes. They were part of the human fabric, even if history tried to pull the thread loose. Some of the most moving records come not from court trials or punishments, but from casual notes. A nun describes her companion's laughter as the sound that makes the morning warmer. A monk wrote that he feels whole only when sitting beside a certain brother. These are not metaphors for God. They are not symbols of spiritual joy. They are words of love, personal, honest, and deeply human. Even in strict communities, there were always ways to bend the rules. A late-night visit framed as spiritual guidance. A touch passed off as support during confession. A poem offered as part of a literary exchange. Beneath these excuses was something stronger than doctrine, the need to feel close to someone else. The desire to connect, no matter how dangerous. Some relationships lasted for years. Others ended quickly when suspicion rose. But even brief connections left marks. People remembered. They carried tokens, like a piece of cloth or a shared passage from scripture. Not everything was written down. Some things were kept only in memory. But those memories shaped lives, even if no one ever spoke of them again. In many official histories, these lives were erased. Monks and nuns were described only by their religious devotion, never by their private feelings. But we know better now. We can read what was left behind, and we can see what others chose not to name. Love did not stop at rules. It found its way through gaps in silence. Picture a cold morning in a convent. Frost on the windows. Two women stand beside each other near the chapel door, their sleeves brushing just slightly. One slips a folded note into the other's sleeve. No one notices. No one questions. But something has been shared. A gesture. A risk. A moment. And in the next part, we'll leave behind the quiet shadows and step into rituals made painfully public, where bodies and desires were no longer secrets but performances. Not far from the stone steps of churches and the gated walls of monastic schools, another kind of establishment quietly thrived. You might imagine it would be hidden away, kept discreet, far from the reach of stained glass and holy chants. But in many towns during the medieval period, brothels stood just across the street from churches. Some shared alleys, some shared walls. The proximity was not an accident. It was convenient. For the clients, for the town, even in strange ways, for the church. Brothels were often located near areas of high traffic. Pilgrims, students, merchants, and clergy all passed through the same central districts. A brothel placed beside a chapel made practical sense to city planners. Everyone has already come to town for confession or communion. The extra stop was just a few steps away. It was easier to regulate, easier to tax, and easier to pretend it didn't exist when it sat behind respectable walls. Some records survive from frustrated priests. There were complaints, yes, about sermons interrupted by muffled laughter, or worse, about the challenge of preaching chastity when the echo of beds creaking filtered through thin stone. One bishop noted that he had to pause his Easter Mass because the noise outside became too distracting. He didn't specify what kind of noise. He didn't have to. Everyone understood. Not all clergy were upset, though. Some took a more lenient approach. If the brothel paid its dues, behaved properly, and caused no overt scandal, it could coexist with the sacred. There were even cases of priests offering blessings to newly reopened houses of prostitution. Not officially, of course. But a quiet nod, a muttered prayer, a few coins exchanged under the table. These things happened, especially when the owner had connections, or the priest had his history worth keeping buried. The blurred lines between sacred and profane were more accepted than most modern people might assume. A brothel that operated too far from oversight was more dangerous than one kept in view. That was the logic. Better to contain sin where it could be monitored than to pretend it could be eliminated. So towns approved licenses. Some even set rules: no working on Sundays, no soliciting during Mass, and no public displays too close to the churchyard gate. Of course, these rules were broken as often as they were enforced. The women who worked there weren't always protected. Their proximity to power didn't guarantee safety, but it did mean they were part of the social fabric, not outsiders. They had regular clients, they had arrangements, they had names that appeared in tax rolls and court records, and occasionally in the diaries of passing monks. Students training for the priesthood often passed by brothels on their way to lectures. Some stopped in, some didn't. One chronicler wrote of a theological dispute interrupted by a group of young men laughing about something they'd seen at the house next door. The details are missing. The implication is not, in many cities, the spiritual and the carnal shared the same streets, the same air, the same markets. Only the signage changed. In some towns, the brothel and the church shared more than a wall. They shared politics. Church officials had relatives who ran businesses. Some noble families funded both chapels and brothels with the same stream of wealth. Donations went one way. Rent payments came the other day. Morality was rarely allowed to interfere with revenue. If it did, it was handled quietly, with paperwork. When plague came or war disrupted commerce, brothels closed, but they reopened quickly, sometimes with new staff, sometimes under new management, sometimes with the same dusty curtains and the same regular customers. There is a record of one such reopening that included a blessing from a local cleric. He claimed it was for health and safety. Perhaps it was, or perhaps it was simply the local tradition. The fact that many priests lived close enough to hear everything but rarely acted to stop it says more about medieval attitudes than any official decree. Sin was not seen as something that could be erased, only managed. If a man sinned, he confessed. If a woman sinned, she might pay. But the business of sin kept going, especially when it contributed to the local economy. What surprises modern readers is how normalised it all was. The church thundered against lust in sermons, yet tolerated its practice next door. The contradiction wasn't hidden, it was just ignored. People had to live, institutions had to function, and in that balancing act, some things simply became part of the background. Sometimes. It's easy to believe that medieval life was ruled by clear rules and firm lines. But when you look closer, especially at towns with brothels pressed against chapels, you start to understand that the real medieval rulebook was full of fine print and footnotes, and sometimes very thin walls. Next, we'll step away from the town squares and into the quiet halls of monasteries, where temptation took a different shape, and silence wasn't always so innocent. She entered through the back corridors, not the front gates. Her footsteps were muffled by thick carpets, her sleeves brushed with the scent of rosewater and expensive dye. The royal mistress never held a title, but her presence in the court was undeniable. People whispered about her, watched her, feared her influence, and sometimes imitated her style without ever admitting it. In medieval courts, a king's mistress wasn't just a private companion. She could change policy, break alliances, and shape the image of an entire reign. The power of a royal mistress depended on one thing, the attention of the king. When that attention was unwavering, her reach extended far. She could speak a word about a promotion, and it might happen. She could smile at a proposal, and it might become law. Letters passed through her hands. Ambassadors watched her expressions. Councillors adjusted their tone depending on who she sat beside at dinner. If she laughed, it might soften a decision. If she frowned, a man's future could slip away. Her appearance was never accidental. Bold fabrics, revealing necklines, and imported jewels were part of the performance. It was a delicate dance between seduction and spectacle. When she wore a gown with slashed sleeves or a bodice cut too low, some nobles grumbled, but the younger ladies watched closely. Trends began there, in those glances down the hallways, in those carefully styled braids and embroidered hems. One mistress favoured deep green silk. Within weeks, it appeared in the wardrobes of courtiers across the palace. Even the queens noticed. They had to. That didn't mean the mistress had true security. Quite the opposite. Her position was entirely unstable. All it took was a single turn of the king's mood, or a new face arriving at court, and everything could vanish. A favour withdrawn. A residence taken back. A child once acknowledged is now left out of succession. Some women saw their fortunes collapse in a matter of days. Their names were scratched from ledgers. Servants stopped bowing. Even friends vanished, as if loyalty were contagious and best avoided. Still, many accepted the risk. The rewards, when they came, were real. Land, titles, jewels, even influence over royal children. Some mistresses became unofficial advisors. Some were blamed for the wars. Others were credited with peace. It depended on who wrote the history afterward. But behind closed doors, their opinions carried weight. Sometimes more than bishops. Sometimes more than the Queen. Not all kings allowed their mistresses such reach. Some kept them for pleasure and locked them away. But others relied on them for comfort, for information, for subtle persuasion when no courtier dared speak plainly. One document mentions a king who refused to sign a treaty until his mistress approved the terms. The record doesn't say what her reasoning was, only that the treaty was delayed 2 weeks and then signed with minor changes. It's easy to imagine these women as either villains or victims. In truth, they were often both and neither. They navigated a world where every gesture could be read as a strategy. A misplaced word could cost them everything. A well-timed sigh could gain them land. Some were clever, some were lucky, some were both. They learned when to speak, when to disappear, and when to reappear with just enough mystery to catch the king's eye again. Of course, many in the court resented them. Queens, most of all. But so did aging noblewomen, ambitious men, and clergymen who saw sin in every corner of the palace. Pamphlets mocked them. Poems circulated with cruel verses. But even the insults proved their presence. No one wrote satirical poems about someone irrelevant. What strikes the modern reader isn't just the existence of these women, but how openly they operated. Everyone knew. Everyone adjusted. Some even courted their favour, sending gifts, arranging meetings, and offering flattery. The court functioned not despite them, but often because of them. Without their intervention, some alliances would have failed, some reforms would never have passed. They were part of the machinery, even if their names were left out of official records, and yet, for all their influence, their legacy is often reduced to rumour. They appear in footnotes, in gossip, in portraits with uncertain names. Their children were sometimes recognised, sometimes erased. Their letters were burned or hidden. The architecture of power had no permanent room for them, just temporary chambers that could be cleared out at a moment's notice. Still, they linger in the fabric of history, in faded letters, in the changed laws, in fashion trends that outlasted them, in the sudden rise or fall of a nobleman with no clear explanation. In the next part, we'll move away from royal chambers and into the private world of married life, where even within sacred vows, not everything was as holy as it seemed. In some corners of medieval Europe, the thread that ran through your gown could say more about you than your name. Fabric was not just fabric. It was a statement, a danger, sometimes even a weapon, especially for women, whose clothing choices were monitored not only by tailors, but also by clergy, nobles, and occasionally the law. A hemline too close to foreign fashion, a sleeve stitched in the wrong pattern, and suddenly a woman could find herself accused of sedition, or worse. During times of war, laws often appeared that banned citizens from wearing the styles of the enemy. These rules didn't just apply to military gear or badges, they reached into closets and dressing chambers. If a woman wore a tunic that resembled those of a rival kingdom's court, she might be accused of harbouring sympathies. The connection didn't need to be logical. Simply looking like them was enough. In France, There were moments when certain shades of red or types of pleated skirts became suspect. In England, German-style embroidery could draw unwanted attention. Even if a garment had been made years earlier, it could suddenly become dangerous overnight. It wasn't just about nationalism, it was about obedience. Following the unspoken rules of dress meant showing loyalty to more than a flag. It meant showing loyalty to the hierarchy, the customs, and the church. If your dress was too fine, they might say you were trying to rise above your station. If it were too plain, you could be accused of disrespecting the feast day. It was like walking through a field of traps. You never knew which detail would be the one that turned heads in the wrong way. Women carried the heavier burden. Men could adopt new styles more freely, often in the name of fashion or courtly duty. But for women, especially unmarried ones or those without protection from noble houses, clothing was policed by eyes in the market, in the church, even in their kitchens. Tailors sometimes refused commissions for certain cuts. Some women learned to alter their clothes in secret, adjusting details at the last minute to avoid suspicion. Then there was fabric itself. Sumptuary laws in many regions dictated who could wear which materials. Silk, for instance, might be reserved for nobility, velvet for certain ranks only, and dyed fabrics were particularly fraught. Deep blue might be allowed, but black, especially rich, dense black, was often limited to wealthier classes or mourning garments approved by clergy. If a merchant's wife wore black velvet to a wedding, rumours would start before dessert was served. More dangerously, there were whispered associations between certain types of fabric and witchcraft. If a woman wore foreign linen or garments stitched with unfamiliar symbols, some claimed she was using clothing to cast spells or summon spirits. A high collar might be called a disguise. A hood might be called a veil of deception. One woman in Italy was accused of communing with demons because her scarf had a pattern similar to Islamic calligraphy. It turned out it was just a gift from a travelling cousin. But logic didn't matter much in those trials. Of course, these suspicions weren't always serious. Sometimes they were just excuses. A jealous neighbour might report someone out of spite. A clergyman might lecture against vanity and pick the wealthiest-looking girl as his target. In many cases, accusations stopped at public shaming, but not always. There were stories of women fined, beaten, and even imprisoned over what they wore, not what they said, not what they did, just the fabric that clung to their shoulders. Looking back, it seems absurd that a sleeve or a ribbon could cause so much trouble, but that's because modern eyes forget how much power people attach to appearance. In medieval Europe, identity was public. You were read like a scroll, from your shoes to your head covering. The wrong choice could label you a traitor, a heretic, or worse. And if you didn't have the right family name to protect you, there was little recourse. Some women learned to navigate these rules with skill. They created garments that met the letter of the law but bent the spirit. A seam placed just so, a brooch shaped like a saint's cross, but with tiny initials etched into the back. Resistance came in silk threads and clever folds, quiet acts of defiance that never made it into the chronicles. Even so, many must have felt the tension every morning, standing at their chests or wardrobes, trying to decide what would get them through the day safely. Not what would impress, just what would avoid trouble. It's no wonder fashion remained a silent battlefield. Next, we'll enter an even more dangerous space, where desire and law collided head on the wedding bed, where the body itself became a matter of public interest. There were potions brewed in kitchens where no one asked too many questions, pots that didn't boil for soup, cloth that didn't carry just embroidery. These weren't the kinds of things taught by priests or recorded in monastery libraries, but they lasted, passed hand to hand, whispered behind bread ovens, sewn into the hems of aprons. For those who didn't hold power with a sword or a title, this was how influence took root, quietly and close to the ground. Some believed certain roots, when boiled with goat's milk under the right phase of the moon, could stir affection in the heart of a reluctant lover. Others insisted it wasn't about herbs or timing, but about the intention while stirring. You had to think of the person, picture them, murmur their name, even if just under your breath. That, they said, was how the magic knew where to go. These weren't grand spells, no chants, no cloaks, no lightning. Just simple steps, practiced in warm kitchens by women with tired hands and sharp memories. There were dozens of recipes, all slightly different. A pinch of crushed apple seeds, a lock of hair, a few drops of blood from a pricked finger, hidden in wine. Some were symbolic, some might have done nothing at all, but people believed in them. And in a world where marriages were arranged and desire had little place in daily life, belief was often the strongest ingredient. Women passed these formulas to daughters, cousins, and friends, but they rarely wrote them down plainly. Instead, they stitched hints into linens or tucked instructions between pages of religious texts. Some embroidered symbols into dress linings, a cross for timing, a circle for secrecy. A small cluster of berries stitched in red to mean add before dawn. It was a code, built into daily life, one that men rarely notice, and if they did, most wouldn't dare admit it. In marketplaces, vendors sold little packets of herbs without labels. They said things like for headaches or to sleep better, but the knowing glance told another story. Women who had no education still knew which combinations meant attraction, or loyalty, or lust. There were even love powders, meant to be dusted onto clothing or furniture. No one knew if they worked, but few wanted to risk laughing too loudly. The church, of course, disapproved. Love spells were considered a form of witchcraft, but unless someone got caught with very obvious items, or unless a situation turned sour, most cases went unnoticed. Occasionally, a jealous wife might accuse a rival of using a potion to steal her husband, and sometimes, in those moments, the old recipes came to light, burned scrolls, dug up gardens, confessions extracted with threats, but those were rare. What's more interesting is that some clerics likely knew about these practices and simply looked the other way. After all, not every priest wanted to confront a group of grandmothers passing around bundles of rosemary and saying prayers that didn't appear in the church books. It was easier to pretend it was all innocent, a little domestic superstition, nothing worth a trial. Still, the fear never disappeared entirely. That's why so many of these rituals stayed hidden, not because they were always illegal, but because they felt dangerous. They gave women a sense of control in a world that rarely allowed it. A charm tucked into a drawer could mean hope. A cup of wine steeped with rose petals could mean courage, even if nothing happened, even if no heart was swayed. The act of trying was a quiet rebellion. Over time, many of the original recipes blurred. Some became folk songs. Others ended up in strange corners of herbals or were copied into letters sent between sisters. In a few rare cases, they were carved into wood and buried for safety, but the core idea remained people want to be wanted. And in the absence of free choice, they reached for whatever gave them a chance to shift fate, even a little. It's easy to mock these things now, to imagine dusty herbs and awkward attempts at love through magic. But those who used them weren't fools. They were resourceful. They understood the limits of their world and found ways to carve tiny paths through them. Not with swords, not with speeches, but with teaspoons, thimbles, and a soft cloth. Next, we'll step into a room where desire was no longer hidden in soup pots or fabric seams, but declared openly and publicly the marriage bed, performed under the eyes of a crowd. There were places no one spoke of too loudly, small wooden doors at the side of a church, stone steps behind a monastery wall, worn corners of convent kitchens where the voices always dropped when a baby's cry was heard. These were not the main halls of history, but they were filled with stories that never made it to scrolls or statues, stories of children who arrived quietly and sometimes disappeared just as quietly. Many of these children were born from relationships that were never meant to be seen, a servant and a noble, a monk and a villager, a widow and the wrong man at the wrong time. Sometimes it was affection, sometimes just a moment of loneliness. But no matter the reason, the outcome was the same. A woman alone, and a child expected to be forgotten. Some mothers brought their babies to the church just before dawn. The light would barely be creeping in through the mist. They would place the child near the door, in a little bundle of fabric, maybe with a ribbon or a note, or sometimes nothing at all. Then they would knock, once or twice, and disappear down the road before anyone could ask questions. By the time the church doors opened, the baby would be wrapped in the scent of wool and the chill of morning air, eyes barely open. Others took a different path. They handed the child to a midwife or an old nun with no need to explain. A few coins changed hands. A cradle, maybe carved by a cousin or brother, was passed along. There was no ceremony, no public naming, just a shift of responsibility, sealed by silence. In some cases, the child stayed within the walls of the convent, growing up with no clear story of how they got there. They learned prayers before they ever knew whose face they shared. Occasionally, a child was brought up by someone in the same village but was called an orphan or a niece. Neighbours guessed. Of course, people always guessed. But as long as no one said anything too directly, it remained acceptable. It was the kind of truth that lived between glances, not in words. The mothers were often sent away, especially if they lived in noble houses or served important men. A young woman might suddenly be taken to a distant cousin's home for rest or sent to a convent to reflect. Months later, she returned thinner, quieter, but carrying no child. Most people pretended not to notice. It was better that way, for everyone. Some fathers left behind a small payment, a bag of grain, a ring, a whispered promise that never became more. Others vanished completely. It depended on their station, their shame, and their willingness to be remembered for the wrong thing. It said that some men gave more to their horse than to the woman carrying their child, which, considering the price of a good saddle, might have been true. And yet, these children existed. They filled the corners of monasteries as they served in kitchens. Some became clerics. Some became priests themselves. A few even found their way back to the homes of their fathers, unacknowledged but quietly supported. There were many ways to disappear in plain sight, especially if no one was looking too closely. The records rarely say much. Baptism entries might list only a first name, sometimes a godparent often chosen by the church, but the mother, the father, left blank, or filled with a name everyone knew wasn't real. It was a kind of erasure that passed as kindness, no accusation, no blame, just space where a family should have been. The emotional cost of this silence was rarely measured. Some children grew up always wondering. Some mothers carried the memory in the lines of their hands, in the way they folded cloth or stood quietly during certain hymns. There were no grave markers for lost names, just the understanding that not every life was meant to be spoken of out loud. Still, people remembered. The midwives, the cooks, and the old nuns who took in one more infant than expected. They kept those memories in the way they looked at certain children, or in how they added an extra slice of bread to a plate without saying why. It wasn't always love, but it was something close enough to carry on. Of course, it would be easier to believe that all this was rare, that most families were neat and proper, but the number of children with no listed father, the steady stream of infants at church doors, the quiet understanding in rural towns, all point to something else. This wasn't occasional. It was ordinary, not scandalous, just unspoken. Next, we'll step even deeper into the spaces where secrecy shaped more than just family lines, into the rituals of marriage itself, where the act of love wasn't always private, and silence took a very different form. Not all beliefs stayed within the walls of churches or echoed from marble pulpits. In some corners of the medieval world, far from royal courts and bishops' chairs, there were groups who thought differently. Their villages were quiet, their gatherings small, and their ways rarely written down. But what they believed was clear to them. They saw no sharp boundary between prayer and desire. In their eyes, the body was not an obstacle to holiness. It was a vessel, and sometimes a bridge. These people didn't whisper their beliefs. They didn't pretend they were something else. In their homes, faith lived alongside instinct. They read scripture by firelight, yes, but they also saw the act of love as part of that same devotion. Some even believed that physical union, when done with care and reverence, brought them closer to God. It wasn't about indulgence, it was about unity. They called it sacred alignment, though the church had far less generous names for it. There were rituals involved. Not every time, of course, but during specific nights tied to the moon or the seasons, a couple would prepare by washing with herbs, lighting candles, and saying prayers out loud. The room would be warm, the air thick with sage or rosemary. Cloth would be draped to block out the outside world. They believed that if one entered the moment with a clear heart, then even passion could become a form of praise. Some took this further. They kept verses of scripture near their bedside. A few even recited them during intimacy. Psalms, lines from the Song of Songs, passages that spoke of love, devotion, or divine presence. To them, it wasn't mockery. It was the highest form of respect. They weren't trying to escape sin. They were trying to elevate the act itself, to remove the shame and replace it with meaning. Most of these practices were passed down quietly, from mother to daughter, from healer to apprentice. There were no official books, no public instructions. Just stories, memories, and routines repeated often enough to become sacred by repetition. They didn't aim to challenge Rome. They simply had a different understanding, one that felt older, closer to the soil, and far more forgiving. Of course, not everyone agreed. The institutional church saw such acts as heresy or worse. It didn't matter that the people involved were faithful in other ways, that they attended Mass, gave alms, or lived simple lives. To the church, mixing prayer with passion was a corruption. And so, when these practices were discovered, punishments followed, confiscated texts, burned herbs, fines. In some cases, exile or penance lasted for years. Still, the ideas survived. You can find hints of them in marginal notes written in old prayer books, in village gossip recorded by curious monks, in the private confessions of clergy who, at one point or another, found the division between holiness and hunger harder to maintain than they expected. Even among strict orders, there were those who admitted quietly that the body did not always wait for permission. There were jokes, too, that some men prayed more in bed than in the chapel, that certain women knew the scriptures better than the local priest, especially the parts that spoke of longing. Whether those jokes were kind or cruel depended on who told them, but they reveal something important. People knew. They might not have practiced it, they might not have approved, but they knew others did, and they knew it wasn't as rare as the church claimed. The most fascinating part is how normal it all seemed to those who lived it. There was no grand rebellion, no public speeches, just the quiet confidence that the divine was not limited to stone walls or Latin chants. That joy could be sacred, that the body could pray in ways the mouth could not. In a time when shame was often louder than faith, these small communities held on to something different. It makes you wonder how many households lit candles for both prayer and pleasure, how many couples held hands and whispered psalms before turning to each other with the same reverence. Maybe they weren't saints, but they believed in something, and they believed it could be good. Some might call it confusion, others would call it sin. But for those who lived that way, it wasn't confusing at all. It was clarity. A quiet, stubborn clarity that refused to separate what they felt from what they believed. Coming up, we'll follow the path of those who didn't get the chance to redefine anything. The ones born out of secrets, raised by silence, and often left with nothing but questions about where they came from. The courtroom was real. The judge was real. The scribes, the notaries, the townsfolk peering in through the open door, all very real. But the defendant is standing in the dock. That was a pig, dressed in a small tunic made from a child's coat, with its front hooves tied in place like hands. The pig stood there in front of the magistrate. It had been charged with a crime of lust, and no one in the room seemed to be laughing. In medieval France, and sometimes in neighbouring parts of Europe, animals were treated as legal subjects when they crossed certain lines. They were tried for theft, destruction, and most infamously, for carnal acts with humans. These were not jokes. The proceedings followed legal protocols, complete with accusations, defences, and sentences. Sometimes an official was assigned to speak on behalf of the animal, as if a goat or rooster had any sense of guilt or plea to offer. In one of the most recorded cases, a sow was accused of such a crime. It had supposedly taken part in something obscene with a man, and when the man was arrested, so was the animal. The townspeople wanted justice. The church wanted to make an example. The authorities wanted order, so they brought in tailors to fashion a small outfit for the pig. It was to be treated, they said, like any other criminal, equal before the law. The courtroom was filled with the sound of rustling parchment and wooden benches creaking under weight. Outside, people gathered to whisper about the day's events. The pig, of course, remained silent. It was sentenced to death. A public hanging was arranged. Some say it was buried afterward. Others claim it was left hanging for days. Either way, it had served its purpose. It had taken the punishment for something that society did not know how to speak about openly. In truth, these trials were never about the animals. They were about people. About fear, shame, and the desire to distance oneself from the darker corners of human desire. If a man did something unspeakable, it was easier to say the animal tempted him, that the beast had been guilty too, that it wasn't just one man's failing, but an unnatural act shared. By punishing the creature, they could punish the behaviour, without having to look too closely at the human involved. Sometimes, the animals were not even present. In certain records, there are cases where entire colonies of rats or swarms of insects were put on trial for ruining crops or spreading illness. The court would summon them, a bailiff would go out and call into the field. The defendants, naturally, did not appear, but the ritual had been fulfilled. There had been a process, and the people could feel, even briefly, that the world was being brought back under control. The strangest part is how serious it all was. There were legal texts written on how to conduct trials involving animals. Some of them went into great detail about the rights of the accused, the necessary witnesses, and even the possibility of appeal. This wasn't a theatre, it was a belief that sin was contagious, that wrongdoing had to be rooted out completely, that even beasts could be touched by evil if men let it in. For the modern reader, it might all sound absurd. A pig in a dress standing trial, a goat receiving the last rites. But to the people living then, it was part of a moral universe where justice needed to be seen, and more importantly, where shame needed to be relocated, away from the man and onto something that couldn't argue, couldn't speak, couldn't confess. There is a strange kind of logic in it. By pretending the animal shared the guilt, they allowed themselves to believe the danger had passed, the act had been punished, the memory could be buried with the body, and the community could move on, heads held a little higher. Of course, it didn't work. The behaviour didn't stop, the urges didn't vanish, but for a few days, maybe a week, there was quiet, and in that quiet, people could pretend they had done the right thing. It's worth noting that these animal trials declined over time. By the late Middle Ages, they became less common, and by the Renaissance they were mostly gone. But the mindset behind them, blame, redirection, and the deep discomfort with desire, stayed much longer. Soon, we'll turn to a different form of silence, one where shame wore finer clothes, where children were born without names, and their mothers watched from windows, never allowed to speak of how they got there. There was nothing romantic about the way the Black Death arrived. It swept across towns and villages with no sense of timing or fairness. People died in the middle of prayer, in the middle of dinner, in the middle of burying someone else. Graves were dug before names could be carved. Carts moved through the streets with bodies stacked like firewood. But even in that setting, when everything smelled of rot and fear, people still reached for one another. The instinct to touch, to be held, to feel skin against skin didn't go away. It grew stronger. With death around every corner, desire stopped asking for permission. Couples met in barns, behind chapels, in abandoned houses. They didn't light candles or whisper vows. They simply lay down, if only for a moment, and reminded themselves that they were still alive. One account tells of a young woman who found herself suddenly alone after her sister died in the early weeks of the plague. The grave was fresh. The man who had helped cover it with the earth stayed behind for a moment longer. She didn't know his name. He didn't ask hers. They sat on a broken bench near the edge of the cemetery. The sky was dark. She reached for his hand, and he didn't pull away. They didn't speak, and when they lay down on the ground beside the wall, it wasn't out of